Sonic's pretty cool, right? I mean, I made a video ribbing on Sonic Blast, but the fact that I've even played Sonic Blast in the first place is definitive proof that I'm secretly a huge Sonic nerd. So what do you do when you're a huge fan of Sonic and have absolutely no drawing talent? That's right, you make a Sonic sprite comic. Yes, that's right, my secret shame. I had a sprite comic series. Several, in fact. It's actually been a long time since I've even seen a sprite comic. I think they've basically died out now. Or at least they've gone underground. But whilst digging through some archives of my old website, I found that, much to my dismay, some of my old sprite comics have been archived. That means I'm now obliged to look at them. It's been, 19 years since I made these, and it still makes me shudder to think about them. But perhaps it'll be cathartic to review them. But first, let's get totally sidetracked and have a look at my main inspiration for making sprite comics in the first place. That's my Sonic. Because that's what this video is really about. And this is one hell of a rabbit hole. So That's My Sonic was a really cool sprite comic. Also, I thought at the time, because I was 10 years old. There were 180 of these, and I don't know why, because they were never good. But even so, I've done my duty and read all of them. It took me over an hour. The things I do in the name of obscure internet history. So let's get a brief overview of what happens. In the first comic, Knuckles gets a TV for the gang. Tails' presence here is kind of strange because it is pointless. The second comic has some now completely outdated memes, or fads as we called them at the time. Then the third comic introduces one of the main hooks of the comic that I remember. Everyone moves into a house together and gets up to all sorts of zany hijinks. Sonic hits on Knuckles, and it's also implied that he hangs around with Tails so much because he has a preference for young boys. Despite me remembering that the house thing was actually a huge plot point, all semblance of continuity gets thrown out the window a few comics later, and the remainder of the comic is essentially just random nonsensical bullshit. This comic does, however, address something commonly overlooked in media. When do the characters go to the toilet? Anyway, the house doesn't have a toilet for some reason, and it becomes a recurring joke that Sonic hasn't used a toilet until he literally explodes into a shower of piss in comic 94. Thankfully, this plot point is resolved in comic 104 when Sonic finally finds a toilet. In comic 20, Knuckles calls Sonic gay and then spontaneously combusts. I'm not even sure what to talk about. This entire comic is random to the point where I feel like it's like reading another language even. The characters don't seem to actually interact, they're all having their own arbitrary conversations and there's no flow. I feel kind of embarrassed that I even used to think this was cool, but I'm certainly not alone here. Something catapulted this man's comics into the limelight, so there must have been plenty of young Sonic fans enjoying his work. Eventually, That's My Sonic starts to break the fourth wall and talk about its creator, Psyguy, and then it starts telling us to buy his merchandise. Then when nobody buys anything, it's announced he's no longer selling anything. But then he decides to sell merch again, and he becomes a character in his own comic, represented by this very cool, original green edit of Sonic with bat wings. I think comic 73 really encapsulates That's My Sonic. Absolutely nothing changes for 3 frames, and then one character exclaims, "Peaches!" with absolutely no context. And so after a grueling hour, I've read all of That's My Sonic. I've read comics 101, 158, and the penultimate comic, 179, are missing. But it doesn't really matter because none of them made sense anyway. Anyway, oh god, there's more! Delving into our favourite tool, the Wayback Machine, we can find that there is somehow much, much more of this. Okay, so somebody made a bad sprite comic back in the early 2000s. So what? Plenty of us read it at the time, and for whatever reason we enjoyed it. It's aged badly, but does that make it so bad? Could Sonic being a gay paedophile and all the homophobic jokes of That's My Sonic be some kind of foreshadowing? Just who was Psyguy really? Well, Psyguy's real name is Brian Bobian? He's most well known for hosting comic website Fireball 20XL, home to the classic That's My Sonic, and also Dirty Power, which was a hand-drawn comic he made. That's My Sonic for some reason became the dominant comic, and so Dirty Power was all but forgotten about. With the unprecedented popularity of Fireball 20XL, it actually became somewhat of a webcomic ring, so many other people's comics were also hosted there. Being the owner of this website meant that Psyguy held a lot of power and influence. Although I can't recover all the comics there, I have recovered a small selection from Dirty Power, Chaos Diamonds 3, and the sequel to That's My Sonic, That's My Sonic 2. Unfortunately, some of it is basically lost forever, or at least lost for now. There's a lot more hand-drawn stuff amongst this, with some clearly very talented artists working on these comics, alongside Psy, who just added these out-of-place speech bubbles or something. Whilst browsing Chaos Diamonds 3, I was going to say that this series seems to take on a more serious tone than That's My Sonic. Then it ruins it by making a penis joke, and the story quickly nosedives. And, well, it's kind of better than That's My Sonic. Dirty Power doesn't even feature Sonic characters, and is a bit more serious in tone. There's no dick jokes in sight. I guess the demand for so random humour was there, and that's why That's My Sonic succeeded where this failed. This brings us to That's My Sonic 2, which starts out hand-drawn before, for some reason, reverting to a sprite comic format. But there are clearly much higher standards for the art. There is, however, not much hope for the story itself, with Comic 2 featuring Sonic farting, and Knuckles subsequently dying of a brain aneurysm as a result. And the peak of comedy for this series still seems to be Sonic being gay. Psyguy himself gained some notoriety amongst fellow creators for being lazy. I wonder why. Most of these comic series I've been talking about just fizzled out, abandoned and unfinished. But even so, Fireball 20XL became hugely well known, and it was quite an icon of internet culture back in the day. Psyguy eventually branched out from comics, presumably as his audience grew up and realised that they weren't very good. He began working on abridged parodies, such as the very funny Sonic Bastardized, in which Brian and others put on silly voices over the Sonic the Hedgehog movie. Okay, fine, I admit it. I thought this was hilarious when it first came out. There's also the Wachow podcast. I wonder what it's about. Yeah, it's a podcast and talk show. Yeah, but it's filled with dick jokes. Yeah. So hey, why don't you join us? Yeah. And listen to the goodness. That's the description. It's also literally described as, it's like a kick in the nuts. I probably don't need to explain that that doesn't make the podcast sound like a good experience. Probably because it's not. So what great things do we have to look forward to in this podcast? Well, I found some random Yu-Gi-Oh blog that talks about it. Over the course of 7 weeks, cast members read out the entire script of The Lion King, after it had been translated into Spanish, then German, then back into English. Then they did the same with episodes of Yu-Gi-Oh! I wonder where that idea of Psyguy being lazy came from. As much as I would like to listen to all 288 hours of these podcasts, they're now scrubbed from the internet. I listened to 6 minutes of episode 314, and I didn't enjoy it very much. It seems Wachow is basically a podcast where a bunch of people get together and talk over each other. People enjoyed it, so it's fine, I suppose. But of course there was a whole load of drama stemming from this. Chris Cale, in his own words, otherwise known as the Sonic bed sex haver. I'm not looking that up. Chris was a podcaster maintaining the website Ozzle Tower, a podcast network. Seeking more regular content and seeing Psyguy asking fans for money on Twitter to continue hosting Wachow, Chris reached out to offer to host Wachow on his website for free, to draw in some more traffic to Muzzle Tower. Chris only ever heard from Brian when there was an issue with the site. Once Brian realised it was in fact Webmaster Pete in charge of maintaining the website, Brian no longer bothered to contact Chris. He simply leached off the goodness of these people. Wichow, for whatever reason, was incredibly popular and led to Muscle Tower having the majority of its bandwidth usage from people seeking it out. Nobody seemed especially interested in the other shows. Chris, trying to still make the most of this, asked to appear on Wichow to help promote Muscle Tower. Psy, in response, flaked on him for weeks on end, and then talked shit about him in the pre-show. Brian continued to take advantage of this goodwill and tried to host Wichow on his own website, so his listeners could completely bypass Muscle Tower, whilst still taking full advantage of their free hosting. Chris, as we will find out, got off lightly. Brian took advantage of him and made attempts to belittle and gaslight him, but it was mostly brushed off. The final kicker was that Brian had a page on Fireball20XL saying, "Donate to keep Wichow alive. I pay for the servers out of my own pocket," which was of course grossly misleading. And we get on to the begging for money. This started as early as "That's my Sonic," Psyguy playfully saying he lives in a garbage can with a computer. But over time he has made quite a habit of begging for money, making up sob stories, and generally extorting people. Without bringing Psyguy's parents into this, they're basically rich. They tried to look after their son, they bought him a car, they paid for his college tuition and maintenance, everything. Psy has never had to even think about money in his life. He's never had to pay his own way. It's not that you do not deserve to be paid for your work simply because you can afford not to be. It's the way he misled people. Begged for money, pretended that there was great hardship in hosting fees for his podcast, for which he did not pay for hosting, amongst other things. And how do we know all this? Well, that leads to the worst part of all, the sexual abuse allegations. I don't think it's necessary to go into many details about this, but in summary, Psyguy has been called out for taking advantage of young girls and behaving very abusively towards them. Some of these girls were as young as 13, and many were authors or collaborators working for Fireball20XL. Brian was, of course, in his mid to late 20s at this point. Upon being called out on it, he threatened legal action to try and silence his victims. And when that failed, like a true narcissist, he tried to make himself out to be the real victim, talking about suicidal ideation because of how these vulnerable people had allegedly made him feel. A number of his victims have spoken out, and they've clearly been through significant trauma, with the effects of Brian's abusive behaviours persisting for years to come. There's a mountain of evidence to support the allegations against him, and as a result, Brian took the coward's way out after his attempts to justify his behaviour rightly failed. He ran away. He attempted to create a new persona under the name Bitpolar, but people immediately flagged this. He's made a few more attempts at new accounts, but these have quickly been called out and fallen flat. Although Brian has tried to erase all traces of Fireball20XL, we all know, nothing is ever truly gone from the internet. So me, one day thinking, what happened to those That's My Sonic Sprite comics I used to read? Turned into this. All that really remains is a few leftovers on Newgrounds and whatever you can scrape from the internet archive.